I still remember that October morning cold, gray and heavy, as if the sky itself sensed the storm about to rip through my life. My husband, Douglas, always the self-proclaimed cornerstone of our family, left the house in his crisp suit, planting a detached kiss on my forehead and muttering, "Don't wait up for dinner." At the time, I had no idea that within just a few hours, my world, everything I trusted, would collapse in two devastating ways. One from inside my body, and the other from the man I'd shared 2 decades of my life with. I was at the oncology clinic in Charleston to get test results after weeks of unexplained fatigue and weight loss. The doctor entered the room, gentle-eyed but firm-voiced, and said, "Mrs. Ellison, I'm very sorry, but we found a malignant tumor in your pancreas." His words hit like a freight train. I barely registered anything after that, just the sound of my own pulse pounding in my ears, like someone had ripped open the curtain, shielding me from a future I was never prepared to face. But that was just the first blow. Not even an hour after leaving the clinic, still sitting numb behind the wheel of my car, trying to remember how to breathe, my phone buzzed. A message from Douglas. It wasn't a question, not a check-in, not a "how did it go?" All it said was, "When you have a moment, call my lawyer. I want a divorce." I was paralyzed. Not only was my own body turning against me, but the man I trusted most had decided to discard me like something broken, something no longer worth keeping. No warning, no mercy. And as I'd soon find out, through a tip from a mutual friend, he had already moved on. He wasn't just preparing to leave, he was living a second life, flaunting his affair with a younger woman he affectionately called his daily dose of sunshine after returning from so-called business trips. Suddenly, all those unexplained absences, cold stares, and snide comments about my appearance and fatigue made a cruel kind of sense. I don't know which part hurt more, knowing my days might be numbered or realizing that the man who once swore to be by my side in sickness and in health had chosen to walk away the moment I needed him the most. The two betrayals, the one from within and the one beside my, intertwined into a kind of pain I can't fully describe, quietly devouring me moment by moment. But I didn't collapse that day. Somehow, deep beneath the numbness, something began to stir, not hatred, not even rage, but something far more primal, the will to survive. The very next day after receiving that cold, 6-word message from Douglas, the man I had devoted over 2 decades of my life to, I returned to our home, still clinging to the faint hope that perhaps it was a mistake, a moment of panic, or something he would apologize for once we sat down and spoke like the husband and wife we once were. But when I stepped inside the front door, the silence was deafening, and the energy in the air felt different, emptier, colder, as though the house itself had already expelled me. I found him in his office, sipping bourbon in the middle of the afternoon with a relaxed smirk, the kind he used to wear when he closed a lucrative deal, not when confronting a woman recently diagnosed with cancer. Before I could speak, he turned to me and said in the most detached tone imaginable, "It's good that you found out. I'm tired of pretending. You deserve the truth." I stood frozen, unsure what he meant, until he followed up with a brutal clarity I never saw coming. "Her name is Kayla. She's 32, radiant, and makes me feel alive, something you haven't done in years." I could barely comprehend his words at first, because my mind refused to believe that someone could be so callous. But as he continued, it became painfully clear that this wasn't a slip of judgment or a fleeting affair. He wasn't sorry. In fact, he was proud, boasting, even about the life he was building with her, a life that no longer included me, even though I had stood by him through job losses, family deaths, and moments when he had nothing but me. I asked him quietly, because my voice had barely returned, how he could do this now, of all times, when I was facing something so terrifying and uncertain. He laughed, not cruelly, but indifferently, and replied, "Don't make this about your illness. This marriage has been over for years. I've just been waiting for the right moment." He then stood up, walked past me, and added with a smirk that will haunt me forever, "You're not exactly a trophy wife anymore, Evelyn. I need someone who looks like she belongs on my arm, not someone dragging around a medical file." Those words burned more than any biopsy or diagnosis ever could. I had been reduced to an inconvenience, a blemish on his image. He wasn't leaving because we had grown apart or because we no longer connected. He was leaving because I was no longer pretty enough, healthy enough, or useful enough to elevate his public life. He didn't want a partner, he wanted a prop. And then came the second blow, the legal one. He tossed a folder onto the table and said casually, "I've already filed the initial divorce paperwork. My lawyer, Alan Myers, will be in touch. I'd appreciate it if you vacated the house within a week. You can leave the keys on the counter." I didn't even cry. Not then. I couldn't. There was no room left for tears when every nerve in my body was already screaming in betrayal. Instead, I nodded mechanically, silently, and picked up the papers, staring at the name of a law firm I knew well. I had once worked alongside Alan in a community legal outreach program. He was sharp, ambitious, but he wasn't prepared to deal with Minot, the woman I was becoming. Later that evening, Douglas's associate stopped by to deliver additional document zones he claimed I needed to review. The young man looked embarrassed, like he knew what kind of man he was representing. "He asked me to pass these along," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. As he turned to leave, he paused, then added in a quiet voice, "For what it's worth, I think he's making a huge mistake." That small sliver of compassion cut deeper than I expected. It reminded me that despite how worthless Douglas had made me feel, I wasn't invisible. I wasn't finished. Sitting alone at the dining table that night, surrounded by silence and shadows, I reread every clause in our prenup, the one Douglas insisted on all those years ago when he first launched his business. I remember thinking it was odd that he had been so specific about infidelity clauses, but at the time I signed without hesitation because I trusted him. Now, flipping through those pages, one paragraph stood out in bold. "In the event of extramarital affairs initiated by the husband, the wife shall be entitled to no less than 50% ownership of all shared and business assets acquired during the marriage." Suddenly, it all made sense why he was so eager to rush the process, to push me out without confrontation. He was hoping I'd be too heartbroken, too sick, too distracted to remember what I'd signed all those years ago. He thought he'd wear me down with humiliation until I simply walked away empty-handed. But what Douglas didn't realize was that I wasn't the same woman who had once cooked his dinners and quietly absorbed his passive-aggressive remarks. I was no longer operating from a place of fear or weakness. He had misjudged me entirely, and in doing so, had handed me the very weapon I needed to reclaim my dignity and my future. I didn't move out right away, not because I couldn't, but because my mind, my heart, and my body were paralyzed by the weight of everything that had descended on me at once. I would sit in the same chair by the window for hours, staring out at nothing, the papers Douglas sent still untouched on the coffee table, their clean, legal precision mocking the emotional wreckage they represented. Each page was a reminder that I had not only lost my health, but had been discarded like a broken object, without ceremony, without dignity, and worst of all, without closure. In those early days, grief didn't come in. Wavesit was an unrelenting flood. I cried until my chest ached and my throat felt raw, and when the tears stopped, a suffocating silence would settle over the house like a fog. I stopped answering phone calls. I turned down visits from friends who genuinely wanted to help, because the thought of explaining the betrayal over and over felt unbearable, like picking at a wound that hadn't stopped bleeding. I had always been the strong one, the listener, the caretaker, the one who had it together, and now I couldn't even bring myself to shower some days. But what struck me hardest wasn't just the loneliness. It was the disappearance of people I thought would stand by me, of the very life I had built piece by piece. Some of our closest mutual friends began to ghost me entirely, likely uncomfortable with the drama or too cowardly to choose sides, while others had clearly been won over by Douglas's narrative, which I could only imagine painted me as the frigid, overworked wife who had let herself go. No one asked about the cancer. No one wanted to hear my side. What made it worse was that Douglas didn't just move on, he celebrated it. Within a week, he had posted vacation photos with Kayla, sipping cocktails on the deck of a rental yacht in Miami, smiling like a man who had finally shed the burden of a dying wife. My cousin forwarded the pictures to me out of anger, thinking it would validate my pain, but all it did was deepen the wound. The woman he replaced me with looked like the anti-me youthful, carefree, untouched by hardship or illness. And there he was, kissing her forehead in broad daylight while I was scheduling my next round of chemotherapy. It would be dishonest to say I didn't think about giving up. There were moments, especially late at night when the house creaked with emptiness, when I genuinely questioned whether fighting was worth it. My body was failing me. My marriage had imploded in the cruelest possible way, and the life I had known had vanished without warning. I felt like I had been exiled from my own existence. One night, I found myself sitting on the cold tile of the bathroom floor, wrapped in a robe that used to belong to Douglas, because no matter how much I hated him, I couldn't bring myself to let go of everything that reminded me of who we used to be. I stared at my reflection in the mirror, hollow-eyed and pale, my hair already thinning from treatment, and whispered to no one in particular, why wasn't I enough? The truth is, I had given him the best years of my life. I had supported him when his first business failed, when he lost his father, when he was too depressed to get out of bed for days. I had worked double shifts to keep us afloat while he rebuilt his career, and I had done it without resentment, believing in his potential more than he ever believed in mine. And now, the moment I faltered through, no fault of my own, he decided I was a burden, a liability, something to be replaced rather than loved. I think every woman at some point wonders how much of herself she gave away for the sake of us, and whether us was ever real to begin with. That night, sitting on that bathroom floor, I realized that Douglas had never really seen Manat the way I saw him. Not with the same depth or loyalty. He saw what I could provide, how I made him look, how I filled the gaps in his life. But the moment I needed something in return, real support, unconditional love, he had nothing to offer. That was the turning point, though I didn't know it then. Because somewhere in the wreckage of that night, beneath the weight of grief and betrayal, a small flickering truth began to emerge. If no one else was going to fight for me, I had to fight for myself. When you're brought to your knees by betrayal, illness, and abandonment all at once, the world around you doesn't stop to grieve with, it simply moves on. And so, while Douglas paraded his new life as if I had never existed, I began piecing myself back together in silence, without fanfare, without witnesses, and without anyone applauding the small victories that, to me, felt monumental. I moved out of the house we once shared not because he asked, but because I couldn't breathe within those walls anymore. Every room whispered reminders of what had been lost, not just between us, but within myself. I packed only what mattered me: case files, some old photographs of my parents, and the prenup agreement that he had so confidently drafted a decade earlier, believing I'd never need it. What he didn't realize, as I pulled away from the driveway for the last time, was that I wasn't running, I was regrouping. I returned to my childhood home in Savannah, Georgia. Modest, aging colonial-style house with creaky floors and sun-warmed windowsills that still smelled faintly of jasmine in the afternoons. It had been in my name since my father passed, and though it lacked the polish of Douglas's modern mansion, it held something far more valuable: peace. There, I could think without judgment, heal without performance, and most importantly, plan. While Douglas assumed I would unravel in despair, I began revisiting every detail of our financial history with the meticulousness that had once made me a rising star at Harper, Caldwell, the law firm I left behind for him years ago. With every bank statement and clause I reviewed, a new piece of power returned to me, like muscle memory reawakening after a long coma. I contacted a close colleague, Cynthia Morales, someone I trusted implicitly who now ran her own legal practice in Atlanta, and asked if she could represent me during the divorce proceedings. She agreed without hesitation, though I told her one thing up front. I wanted no special treatment. I wanted the process to be clean, quiet, and exact. Once I had my legal team in place, I reached out to Alan Myers Douglas's attorney and requested a formal meeting. I chose a neutral location, a small cafe near downtown Charleston, one Douglas and I used to frequent during better times. When Alan arrived, he wore the mask of calm confidence, likely expecting a frail woman fueled by bitterness and emotion. What he found, instead, was a woman who had nothing left to lose and therefore no reason to fear anything at all. I greeted him kindly but firmly, and before he could begin his rehearsed dialogue, I opened my binder and slid the prenup across the table. "I assume your client didn't mention this," I said, watching the subtle flicker of surprise cross his face. Alan glanced at the document, his brow furrowing slightly as he flipped through pages, and I continued. "It's all there, signed, notarized, and enforceable. The clause is very specific about infidelity and the 50% equity in all business assets accumulated during the marriage." He was silent for a moment, perhaps weighing his options, perhaps cursing Douglas under his breath. Eventually, He nodded and asked professionally, but not without tension, if I had evidence of the affair. I responded by placing a small envelope on the table. Inside were printed messages, hotel bookings, photographs from social media, and one particularly incriminating screenshot where Douglas had described Kayla as the upgrade he deserved. Alan didn't need to read every page to understand the outcome. He simply closed the file, exhaled through his nose, and said he would need to speak with his client again before proceeding. I told him I understood, that I would not tolerate delay tactics or manipulation. I'm not looking for revenge, I said clearly, but I will not be robbed of what I am owed. That night, back home in Savannah, I stood barefoot in the kitchen making tea, staring out the window at the soft glow of street lamps filtering through moss-covered trees. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel broken. I felt focused. I hadn't screamed. I hadn't begged. I hadn't fought dirty. I had done what Douglas never expected. I stayed calm. I stayed prepared, and I let the truth do the talking. What he had underestimated, more than anything else, was that grief does not weaken everyone. For some, like me, it sharpens, it clarifies. And though I was still facing chemotherapy and sleepless nights and the scars of a crumbling marriage, I was no longer drowning. I was swimming slowly, silently, but with purpose, toward a shore he would never reach again. It didn't take long after that meeting at the cafe for the dominoes to begin falling, only this time, they weren't toppling over me. They were crashing around Douglas, who had spent so long underestimating the quiet power of someone he had discarded. I had thought he might at least attempt to defend himself with dignity, but dignity was a currency he had long since depleted. A few days later, he called me directly, breaking the very agreement we had set through our attorneys, and though I considered ignoring the call, something told me it was time to let him hear the voice of the woman he once thought would simply disappear. The moment I answered, his tone was no longer triumphant or smudged, it was frantic and thinly veiled in desperation. "Evelyn, what the hell did you say to my lawyer?" he barked, trying to regain some semblance of control. I let him sit in the silence for a beat before answering. "Funny, I thought we weren't speaking outside legal channels. Is your confidence cracking already?" His anger flared, but underneath it I sensed panic. He rambled about how Alan had dropped the case without explanation, how he had contacted 3 more attorneys in town and all had declined to take him on. "Did you threaten them?" he asked accusingly. I almost laughed, not out of cruelty, but out of the absurdity of his ignorance. "I didn't have to," I said calmly. "They know who I am, Douglas. They know my record. No respectable attorney wants to walk into court defending a man who cheated on his wife while she was undergoing chemotherapy and then violated the terms of a binding prenup." For the first time, he was speechless. And it occurred to me then that he had never actually believed any of this would touch him. He had built his life on the illusion that charm and money would buy him immunity. But now he was starting to understand that neither of those things stood a chance against consequence. The next week, my lawyer received a message from a newly retained representative of Douglas's junior partner from a second-tier firm who requested a settlement discussion. We agreed, under strict terms. I had no intention of dragging this out, but I also wasn't about to make it easy for him to crawl away with his empire intact. When we sat across from each other at the negotiation table, I barely recognized him. His suit was impeccable, but his posture betrayed everything: tension in the shoulders, twitching fingers, darting eyes. Kayla, the woman he had sacrificed everything for, was notably absent. Rumor had it she had distanced herself once it became clear that Douglas's fortune would not survive the fallout. Gold rarely clings to rust. He tried one last time to spin the narrative in his favor, beginning with a tepid apology that I had no patience for and ending with a desperate plea that we handle this amicably, as if the months of humiliation and abandonment could be swept away with a few kind words. When he realized sympathy wasn't in the room, he moved to bargaining, offering to buy out my share of the business for a fraction of what it was worth. I let him speak, let him embarrass himself with lowball figures and nostalgic references to our better days. Then, I quietly slid across the full valuation prepared by my legal team, backed by evidence of asset growth during the years I supported him both emotionally and financially. "This is what I'm entitled to," I said, meeting his eyes without flinching. "And this is what you're going to sign if you want this to end without a trial." His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the pen, not because the number surprised him, but because he finally understood that this wasn't revenge, it was justice. A justice born not from cruelty, but from precision, patience, and a relentless refusal to disappear, just because someone had decided I no longer have value. He signed. I walked out of that office without looking back, not because I didn't care, but because I no longer needed to see what was left behind. I had reclaimed not just half of the business we once built together, but every ounce of my dignity he had tried to strip away. What began as a collapse had become a quiet revolution, and the woman he left behind was no longer the woman sitting across from him. She was stronger, sharper, and no longer afraid. In the weeks that followed the final settlement, something unexpected happened, not all at once, but slowly, like dawn, easing its way through the remnants of a long, bitter night. I began to feel free, not in the theatrical sense of breaking chains or celebrating victory, but in the quieter, more profound way of reclaiming space in my own life that had been occupied for too long by pain, betrayal, and silence. Douglas, unsurprisingly, didn't disappear quietly. He tried once or twice to reinsert himself into my life under the guise of closure, or worse, reconciliation, convinced, perhaps, that a woman in remission and middle age might be desperate enough to consider the comforts of familiarity over the risks of standing alone. But I was no longer the version of myself who feared solitude more than disappointment. The woman he had left behind had died the day he sent those divorce papers through someone else's hands. The woman I had become through fire, humiliation, and resilience had no interest in returning to the ashes. Word traveled quickly in our circles, as it always does. His mistress, now long gone, had reportedly vanished once the financial perks dried up, and with no firm willing to represent him locally, he was left scrambling to save face in a community that quietly knew the truth. Meanwhile, I had appointed a manager to handle my share of the company, which, thanks to my decisions, had remained stable and profitable. I wasn't interested in controlling the business, I simply wanted what I had earned. With the settlement secured and my health improving, I used a portion of my compensation to create a small foundation in my mother's name, supporting women facing both legal and medical battles without the luxury of a voice. I never sought revenge, not in the sense people expect when they hear a story like mine. I didn't want Douglas to suffer for the sake of watching him fall. What I wanted, and what I ultimately achieved, was something far more rare. Justice without cruelty, dignity without noise, and closure without apology. In choosing not to stoop to his level, I forced him to see me not as the broken woman he abandoned, but as the one who stood back up and never looked back. And yes, there were moments when the silence in my home still lingered a little too long, or when I caught myself reaching for the other side of the bed. But those moments didn't hurt the way they used to. They reminded me of how far I had come, how much of myself I had reclaimed, and how deeply capable I was of writing a new chapter on where I didn't have to shrink to make room for someone else. I know now that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers in the quiet decisions we make when no one is watching. It lives in the paperwork filed with resolve, in the calm voice during confrontation, and in the grace we choose, even when others give us none. So, if you've made it this far into my story, I hope you'll take this with you. You are never too old, too broken, or too far gone to take your life back. You don't have to destroy someone else to rebuild yourself, you just have to stop letting them define what you're worth. If my story resonated with you, please consider subscribing to this channel for more true stories of strength, justice, and second chances. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that it's never too late to rise again. Shalde, you are not alone. Shalde, you are not finished. Shalde, and you are absolutely not powerless. This is the Underdog's revenge. And this was my return.